Maria Santos had always been different from other girls her age. While her classmates spent their afternoons gossiping about boys or shopping for makeup, she found herself drawn to the quiet precision of target shooting. At 17, she had already earned a reputation as one of the most promising young marksmen in her small Colorado town. The regional championship was only 3 days away, and Maria could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. Her father, a former military sniper himself, had been training her since she was 12 years old. Every morning before school, they would drive out to the old quarry where he had set up a makeshift shooting range. The sound of gunfire echoing off the rocky walls had become as familiar to Maria as her own heartbeat. Her rifle was everything to her. The custom-built weapon had been a gift from her grandfather, who had served in Vietnam and understood the bond between a shooter and their weapon. Every part of the rifle had been carefully selected and fitted. The barrel had been hand-lapped to perfection, the trigger adjusted to break at exactly 2.5 pounds, and the scope zeroed with mathematical precision. Maria knew every scratch on the stock, every subtle vibration the weapon made when fired. The high school shooting team was small, only 8 members, but they had won the state championship 2 years running. Coach Thompson, a retired Marine, ran the team with military discipline. He demanded perfection not just in shooting, but in every aspect of their preparation. Equipment maintenance, physical fitness, mental conditioning, everything had to be flawless. Maria's main rival was Jennifer Walsh, a senior from the neighboring town of Pine Ridge. Jennifer came from a wealthy family and had access to the best equipment money could buy. Her rifle alone cost more than most people earned in 6 months. She was technically proficient and had the backing of a private coach who had trained Olympic athletes. The rivalry between the two girls had been building for months, ever since Maria had beaten Jennifer at the state qualifiers by a single point. The tension at school was noticeable. Other students had started paying attention to the shooting team, something that rarely happened. Local newspapers had picked up the story of the 2 teenage sharpshooters who would face off at regionals. The winner would go on to represent the state at nationals, with college scholarships and recognition hanging in the balance. Maria's daily routine was rigid and unchanging. She woke at 5:30 every morning, did 30 minutes of meditation and breathing exercises, then met her father at the range. They would spend 2 hours practicing, focusing on different aspects of marksmanship. Some days they worked on long-range precision, other days on rapid-fire accuracy. Her father had taught her that shooting was 90% mental and 10% physical. The preparation wasn't just about pulling the trigger. Maria spent hours studying ballistics tables, learning how wind speed and direction affected bullet trajectory. She practiced calculating distances without a rangefinder, estimating wind speed by watching grass and leaves. Her notebook was filled with detailed observations about how different weather conditions affected her shots. At home, Maria's room was a shrine to precision shooting. The walls were covered with certificates and medals from various competitions. A bookshelf held technical manuals on ballistics, biographies of famous snipers, and training guides. Her desk was always perfectly organized, with cleaning supplies for her rifle arranged in precise rows. Even her school books were stacked with military neatness. The other team members looked up to Maria, despite her being one of the youngest. She never bragged about her abilities, but her consistent performance spoke for itself. During team practices, she would often help the newer members with their form and breathing techniques. Her quiet confidence was infectious, and the team had developed an almost unshakable belief in their abilities. Jennifer Walsh, however, was a different story. She was everything. Maria was not outgoing, wealthy, and supremely confident in a way that bordered on arrogance. Jennifer drove to competitions in a luxury SUV filled with custom cases for her equipment. She had multiple rifles for different conditions and a support team that included a dedicated spotter and equipment manager. Her Instagram account was filled with photos of her at various shooting competitions, always perfectly posed and professionally lit. The contrast between the two girls could not have been more stark. Maria drove to competitions in her father's old pickup truck, her single rifle case secured carefully in the back. She wore simple, practical clothing and rarely spoke to the media representatives who had started showing up at events. Her focus was entirely internal, a quiet intensity that those who knew her had learned to respect. Coach Thompson had been watching the rivalry develop with growing concern. He knew that both girls were capable of extraordinary shooting, but he also understood how psychological pressure could destroy even the most talented athlete. He had seen promising shooters collapse under the weight of expectation, their carefully developed skills crumbling when it mattered most. He spent extra time with Maria, not working on her shooting technique, which was already nearly perfect, but on her mental preparation. The local media attention had created an unexpected problem. Suddenly, everyone at school knew about the shooting team and the upcoming championship. Maria found herself the subject of interviews and photo shoots, activities that made her deeply uncomfortable. She preferred the quiet solitude of the range to the bright lights and probing questions of reporters. Her grades, which had always been excellent, began to slip slightly as the pressure mounted. Her father noticed the change in his daughter. The easy confidence she had always displayed was being replaced by a tight-lipped determination that worried him. He had seen this transformation before in young soldiers who were about to face combat for the first time. The key was to channel that nervous energy into focus rather than letting it become a destructive force. He began incorporating stress inoculation into their training, creating artificial pressure situations to help Maria learn to perform under stress. The shooting range had become a second home to Maria. She knew every target stand, every distance marker, every quirk of the facility. The range master, an old-timer named Bill who had been there for 30 years, had taken a special interest in her development. He would often stay late to help her practice, sharing stories of the great shooters he had known over the decades. His weathered hands were steady as rocks, and his knowledge of rifles and ammunition was encyclopedic. Maria's mother, who had never understood her daughter's passion for shooting, had gradually come to appreciate the discipline and focus it required. She saw how the sport had given Maria confidence and taught her to handle pressure. The precision and attention to detail that shooting demanded had carried over into every aspect of Maria's life. Her room was always immaculate, her homework completed with the same methodical care she applied to equipment maintenance. The team's equipment was stored in a locked room at the school, accessible only to Coach Thompson and the team captain. Security had always been a priority, given the value and sensitivity of the weapons involved. Each rifle was secured in its own case, with ammunition stored separately in a fireproof safe. The room was climate-controlled to prevent humidity from affecting the precision instruments, and access was logged and monitored. 3 days before the championship, Maria arrived at school to find an unusual amount of activity around the team room. Coach Thompson was standing in the hallway with the school principal and 2 men in suits she didn't recognize. The look on the coach's face told her immediately that something was very wrong. Her heart began to race as she approached the group, her mind already jumping to worst-case scenarios. The principal explained that there had been a break-in sometime during the night. Security cameras had been disabled, and whoever had done this knew exactly what they were looking for. Nothing else in the school had been touched, not the computer lab, not the science equipment, nothing that would normally attract thieves. Only the shooting team's equipment room had been targeted, and the method of entry suggested someone with knowledge of the facility's security systems. Maria pushed past the adults and looked into the team room. Cases had been opened and their contents scattered across the floor. Scopes had been dismounted, triggers had been adjusted, and several barrels showed signs of tampering. It was clear that this wasn't random vandalism. Someone had deliberately sabotaged their equipment with surgical precision. The damage was subtle but devastating, the kind that would only become apparent when the weapons were actually used in competition. Her own rifle case lay open, and Maria could see immediately that her precious weapon had been violated. The scope mounts had been loosened just enough to throw off her zero. The trigger mechanism had been adjusted, and there were tiny scratches on the barrel that suggested someone had attempted to damage the rifling. Years of careful preparation and meticulous maintenance had been undone in a single night. The police were called, but Maria knew that finding the perpetrator was unlikely. The damage had been done with the expertise of someone who understood precision shooting equipment. This wasn't the work of random vandals or opportunistic thieves. Someone had specifically targeted their team with the intention of destroying their chances at the championship. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. As Maria knelt beside her damaged rifle, running her fingers over the scratches and noting each subtle change, she felt a cold anger building inside her. Someone had tried to steal her dreams, to take away everything she had worked for. The championship was in 3 days, and her rifle, the extension of herself that she had spent years perfecting, was now unreliable. The person responsible had calculated that there wouldn't be enough time to properly repair and re-zero the equipment. Coach Thompson's face was grim as he surveyed the damage. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, how devastating this could be for his team's chances. The relationship between a shooter and their rifle was built over thousands of hours of practice. Each weapon had its own characteristics, its own personality. You couldn't simply substitute another rifle and expect the same level of performance. The sabotage had been designed to be psychologically devastating as well as practically damaging. The other team members began arriving for morning practice, and their faces fell as they saw the scene. The youngest members, who had looked up to Maria and the senior shooters, seemed on the verge of tears. The careful confidence that Coach Thompson had spent months building was cracking before his eyes. This was exactly what the saboteur had intended, not just to damage equipment, but to destroy morale and create doubt. Maria stood up slowly, her jaw set in determination. She looked at her teammates, then at Coach Thompson, and finally at her damaged rifle. In that moment, she made a decision that would define not just the upcoming championship, but her entire approach to facing adversity. The person who had done this thought they understood her, thought they knew how to break her spirit. They had made a critical miscalculation. The investigation into the sabotage moved quickly, but the results were frustrating. Detective Sarah Morrison, who had been assigned to the case, was a methodical woman with 20 years of experience, but she had never dealt with anything quite like this. The perpetrator had been careful, no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, and the security cameras had been disabled with professional precision. Whoever had done this understood both the school's security systems and competitive shooting equipment. Maria spent the morning after the break-in examining her rifle with a magnifying glass, documenting every change that had been made. Her father, who had rushed to the school as soon as he heard the news, worked alongside her in grim silence. They both understood the magnitude of the sabotage. The scope had been deliberately knocked out of alignment. The trigger pull had been adjusted to an inconsistent weight, and tiny metal filings had been introduced into the barrel, a subtle form of damage that would cause accuracy to deteriorate with each shot fired. Coach Thompson gathered the team in the school library, away from the crime scene and the curious eyes of other students. The 8 team members sat in a circle, their faces showing a mixture of anger, disappointment, and fear. Some of the younger members were clearly wondering if they should even bother competing. The coach's voice was steady as he addressed them, but Maria could see the concern in his eyes. He had coached championship teams before, but he had never faced deliberate sabotage. The most disturbing aspect of the crime was how specifically it had been targeted. The saboteur had known exactly which pieces of equipment to damage, and how to damage them in ways that wouldn't be immediately obvious. They had left the less critical gear untouched, focusing their efforts on the precision components that would make the biggest difference in competition. This suggested someone with intimate knowledge of competitive shooting and possibly inside information about the team's equipment. Detective Morrison interviewed each team member separately, looking for any clues about who might have access to the facility and knowledge of their routines. The questions were thorough but yielded little useful information. The team members were tight-knit and couldn't imagine any of their friends or family members being involved in such sabotage. The detective expanded her investigation to include rival teams and anyone who might have a financial stake in the outcome of the championship. Maria's father contacted every gun shop and rifle specialist within 100 miles, looking for someone who could repair the damage in the limited time remaining. The responses were universally the same. Proper repair and re-zeroing would take weeks, not days. The precision required for competitive shooting meant that even small adjustments needed extensive testing and fine-tuning. Maria listened to these conversations with growing frustration, watching her championship dreams slip away. The media coverage of the sabotage added another layer of pressure. Local news stations picked up the story, framing it as a dramatic sports thriller, with echoes of Olympic-level competition scandals. Reporters camped outside Maria's house and the school, asking for comments and theories about who might be responsible. The attention was unwelcome and distracting, but it also brought unexpected support from the community. Anonymous donations began arriving at the school, offered by local businesses and individuals who wanted to help the team acquire replacement equipment. A retired gunsmith named Frank Mueller, who had once worked on rifles for the U.S. Olympic team, volunteered his services free of charge. He examined Maria's damaged rifle with the careful attention of a surgeon, shaking his head at the subtle but effective sabotage. Frank's workshop was a temple to precision engineering. Every tool had its place, and the workbenches were kept spotlessly clean. He had been building and repairing competition rifles for 40 years, and he understood the psychological relationship between shooter and weapon better than anyone. As he worked on Maria's rifle, he explained that the saboteur had been clever. The damage was designed to cause gradual accuracy degradation rather than complete failure. While Frank worked on the rifle repairs, Maria threw herself into alternative preparation methods. She spent hours in the school's gymnasium practicing her breathing techniques and working on her physical conditioning. Competitive shooting required extraordinary body control, the ability to slow heart rate, control breathing, and maintain steady muscle tension for extended periods. She also began practicing with a backup rifle borrowed from the range, trying to adapt to its different characteristics. Coach Thompson arranged for the team to use the indoor range at the local police academy, where they could practice under controlled conditions similar to what they would face at the championship. The police officers who used the facility were impressed by the young shooter's dedication and skill level. Several offered to help with spotting and coaching, sharing their own experiences with high-pressure shooting situations. The backup rifle was adequate but far from ideal. Its trigger was heavier than Maria was accustomed to, the stock didn't fit her perfectly, and the scope had different optical characteristics. Every aspect of the weapon felt foreign. After years of working with her customized rifle, she spent hours adjusting her shooting position and technique, trying to compensate for the differences, but she knew her scores were suffering. Maria's sleep began to suffer as the championship approached. She would lie awake at night thinking about the sabotage, trying to figure out who could have done it and why. Her mind raced through possibilities: a rival shooter, someone with a gambling interest in the outcome, or perhaps just a random act of malice. The uncertainty was almost as disturbing as the sabotage itself. Not knowing who was responsible made her feel vulnerable and paranoid. Her academic performance, which had already been slipping due to competition pressure, fell further as she struggled to concentrate on anything other than shooting. Her teachers, aware of the situation, were understanding and offered extensions on assignments, but Maria was frustrated by her inability to maintain her usual standards in any area of her life. The sabotage had disrupted not just her shooting preparation, but her entire sense of order and control. Detective Morrison's investigation began to focus on a possible connection to gambling interests. She discovered that the championship had attracted unusual betting activity, with large sums being wagered on individual competitors. The amounts involved were significant enough to provide motive for sabotage, and the sophisticated nature of the crime suggested professional involvement. However, tracing the betting activity proved difficult, as much of it was happening through offshore websites and informal networks. Frank Mueller worked 18-hour days trying to restore Maria's rifle to competitive condition. He had to completely rebuild the trigger mechanism, realign the scope mounts, and attempt to repair the damage to the barrel rifling. His skilled hands moved with practiced precision, but even he admitted that the weapon would never perform exactly as it had before. The psychological impact on Maria was a concern that went beyond mere mechanical issues. Maria's father, watching his daughter struggle with the situation, made a decision that surprised everyone. He arranged for her to spend a day with a former military sniper who now worked as a police instructor. The man, whose name was Jack Patterson, had faced similar equipment failures in combat situations and understood the mental toughness required to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Jack's approach was different from anything Maria had experienced. Instead of focusing on the technical aspects of shooting, he emphasized the mental game. He taught her techniques for clearing her mind of distractions, for focusing entirely on the target and the shot process. He shared stories of situations where equipment failure had forced him to adapt quickly, sometimes using unfamiliar weapons under extreme pressure. The training session with Jack was transformative. He helped Maria understand that her relationship with her rifle, while important, shouldn't define her as a shooter. True marksmanship came from within, from the discipline of mind and body that she had developed over years of practice. The rifle was merely a tool, and a skilled shooter should be able to adapt to different tools when necessary. Maria began to approach the backup rifle differently. Instead of fighting its characteristics, she started working with them. She adjusted her shooting stance to accommodate the different stock dimensions, modified her trigger technique for the heavier pull weight, and learned to read the scope's optical signature. Gradually, her scores with the backup rifle began to improve, though they still weren't quite at her usual level. The team's morale began to recover as they saw Maria's determination in the face of adversity. Her refusal to give up inspired the other members, and their own preparation intensified. Coach Thompson organized team-building exercises and group practice sessions designed to strengthen their mental resilience. He knew that the championship would be as much about psychological toughness as shooting skill. 2 days before the championship, Frank Mueller delivered Maria's repaired rifle. His work was masterful, and the weapon looked almost exactly as it had before the sabotage. However, when Maria test-fired it at the range, the results were disappointing. The rifle's accuracy was acceptable for casual shooting but fell short of the precision required for championship-level competition. The subtle damage to the barrel rifling couldn't be completely undone. Maria faced a difficult decision. She could compete with her familiar but compromised rifle, hoping that her experience with the weapon would compensate for its reduced accuracy. Alternatively, she could use the backup rifle, which was mechanically sound but felt foreign in her hands. Either choice involved significant risk, and the championship was only 2 days away. That evening, Maria sat in her room surrounded by her shooting medals and certificates, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The saboteur's plan had been diabolical in its simplicity: create doubt and uncertainty at the worst possible time, when there would be no opportunity for proper recovery. But looking at her collection of awards, Maria realized that each one represented a time when she had overcome some form of adversity. Her father found her there hours later, still lost in thought. Without saying anything, he sat down beside her and picked up one of her earliest medals from a local competition when she was 13. He reminded her that she had won that competition shooting with a borrowed rifle because her own had been damaged in a car accident on the way to the event. Sometimes, he said, the most memorable victories came when everything seemed to be going wrong. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Detective Morrison called to inform them that Jennifer Walsh had been arrested in connection with the sabotage. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Jennifer's fingerprints on a piece of equipment that shouldn't have been in her possession, and testimony from a former teammate who had overheard her discussing ways to undermine the competition. The arrest sent shockwaves through the shooting community and added another layer of complexity to an already emotionally charged situation. Maria's reaction to the news was complicated. Part of her felt vindicated that the saboteur had been identified, but she also felt a strange sadness. Jennifer had been a worthy rival, and learning that she had resorted to sabotage diminished both her achievements and the entire competition. The victory Maria might achieve would always be tainted by the knowledge that her primary competitor had tried to cheat. With only 1 day remaining before the championship, Maria made her final decision about equipment. She would compete with the backup rifle, accepting its limitations while trusting in her own adaptability and mental strength. The choice felt right in a way that surprised her. It represented a commitment to her own abilities rather than dependence on any particular piece of equipment. The final day of preparation was spent in quiet focus. Maria avoided all media contact and spent the morning at the range, making final adjustments to her shooting position and technique with the backup rifle. Her scores were consistent if not spectacular, and more importantly, her confidence was returning. Coach Thompson watched her practice with growing optimism, recognizing the signs of a shooter who was finding their rhythm at exactly the right time. As the team loaded their equipment for the trip to the championship venue, Maria took one last look at her damaged rifle. Despite everything that had happened, she felt grateful for the experience. The sabotage had tested her in ways that normal competition never could, and she had discovered reserves of mental toughness she didn't know she possessed. Whatever happened at the championship, she would face it with a deeper understanding of her own capabilities and a harder-earned confidence than any she had possessed before. The morning of the regional championship dawned clear and cold, with barely a whisper of wind. Perfect conditions for precision shooting. Maria woke at 4:30, her internal clock no longer requiring an alarm after months of early morning training. The hotel room was quiet except for the gentle breathing of her roommate, another team member who had managed to sleep peacefully despite the pressure they all felt. Maria's pre-competition routine was as precise as her shooting technique. She began with 20 minutes of meditation, focusing on her breathing and clearing her mind of all distractions. The events of the past week, the sabotage, the investigation, the arrest of Jennifer Walsh threatened to intrude on her thoughts, but she pushed them aside with practiced mental discipline. Today was about shooting, nothing else. The championship venue was a state-of-the-art facility that had been built specifically for precision rifle competitions. As Maria and her team arrived, she could see competitors from 12 different schools setting up their equipment and beginning their warm-up routines. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation, and she noticed several curious glances directed her way. Word of the sabotage had spread throughout the shooting community, making her something of a celebrity. Coach Thompson gathered his team in a quiet corner of the facility for their final briefing. His voice was calm and steady as he reminded them of the fundamentals they had practiced thousands of times. But Maria could see the concern in his eyes as he looked at her backup rifle. They both knew she was shooting with a handicap, but neither of them would acknowledge it aloud. Mental confidence was too important to undermine with doubts about equipment. The competition format would test every aspect of precision marksmanship. There would be 3 phases: prone position at 200 yards, sitting position at 300 yards, and standing position at 400 yards. Each phase consisted of multiple series of shots, with scoring based on both accuracy and consistency. The total possible score was 200 points, and winning scores typically fell between 190 and 195. Every shot would matter. Maria spent the warm-up period getting reacquainted with the backup rifle's characteristics. The morning air was crisp, and she could feel her muscles responding smoothly to the familiar motions of loading, aiming, and firing. Her breathing was controlled and rhythmic, her heart rate steady. The rifle felt better in her hands than it had during practice, and her first few warm-up shots grouped tightly around the center of the target. Other competitors were watching her practice with interest. Some showed genuine concern for what she had endured, while others seemed to be evaluating whether the sabotage had weakened her as a threat. Maria ignored all of it, focusing entirely on the feedback she was getting from each shot. The backup rifle was teaching her its preferences, and she was learning to accommodate them. The news of Jennifer Walsh's arrest had created a strange atmosphere at the competition. Several shooters from her team were present, but Jennifer herself was notably absent, having been disqualified pending the outcome of the investigation. Her teammates seemed deflated and embarrassed, their own preparation disrupted by the scandal surrounding their former star shooter. Maria felt a mixture of sympathy and relief: sympathy for the innocent team members whose championship had been tainted, and relief that the cloud of sabotage was beginning to lift. Competition officials made a brief announcement about the investigation, stating that all necessary security measures had been implemented to prevent any further incidents. Extra security guards were visible throughout the facility, and competitors' equipment was under constant supervision. The message was clear: this championship would be decided by shooting skill alone. The first phase began at 10 o'clock sharp. Competitors lined up in relay groups based on their qualification scores, with the highest-ranked shooters going in the final relay. Maria found herself in the second-to-last group, positioned between 2 shooters she had competed against before. The familiar faces were comforting, providing a sense of normalcy in what had been anything but a normal week. Prone position shooting was Maria's strongest discipline. The stable position allowed her to fully utilize her exceptional breath control and trigger technique. As she settled into her shooting mat and adjusted the rifle's bipod, she felt a familiar sense of calm descending over her. This was where she belonged, where all the noise and distraction fell away and only the target mattered. Her first shot was a solid 9, slightly left of center but well within the scoring rings. The backup rifle's trigger broke cleanly, and the recoil felt manageable. Maria made a slight windage adjustment and prepared for her second shot. This one was a perfect 10, dead center in the X-ring. She allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction before focusing on the remaining shots in the series. The rhythm of competition shooting was hypnotic. Load, aim, breathe, hold, squeeze, follow through. Each step flowed naturally into the next, a sequence refined through thousands of hours of practice. Maria's shots began to form a tight cluster in the center of the target, each one reinforcing her growing confidence in the backup rifle. By the end of the first series, she had posted a score of 48 out of 50, not her personal best, but respectable, given the circumstances. Between relay groups, Maria walked around the facility to keep her muscles loose. She observed other competitors, noting their techniques and equipment. Several were shooting rifles that cost more than her family's car, equipped with the latest in optical and mechanical technology. But she had learned long ago that expensive equipment couldn't substitute for fundamental skill and mental discipline. The second prone series went even better. Maria's confidence was building with each shot, and she was beginning to anticipate the backup rifle's characteristics rather than simply reacting to them. Her grouping tightened noticeably, and she managed to post a perfect 50 for the series. Spectators in the observation area began to take notice, and she heard murmurs of appreciation for her performance despite the equipment challenges. Coach Thompson watched from the sidelines with growing excitement. He could see that Maria was entering what shooters called the zone, that mental state where everything flowed effortlessly and every shot felt predetermined. It was a rare occurrence in competitive shooting, and when it happened, scores that seemed impossible became routine. He had seen it only a handful of times in his coaching career. The sitting position phase presented new challenges. The position was less stable than prone, requiring greater muscle control and balance. Maria had always been strong in this discipline, but the backup rifle's different balance point meant she had to adjust her technique significantly. She took extra time during the preparation period to find the most comfortable and stable position. Her first sitting series was solid but not spectacular, a 47 out of 50. 2 shots had drifted slightly outside the 10 ring, victims of small balance shifts that she was still learning to control with the unfamiliar rifle. But Maria wasn't discouraged. She could feel herself adapting to the weapon's characteristics, and her confidence remained high. During the break between sitting series, Maria encountered Sarah Chen, a senior from the California team who had been following the sabotage story in the news. Sarah expressed her admiration for Maria's composure under pressure and shared her own story of overcoming equipment failure during a crucial competition. The conversation was brief but encouraging, reminding Maria that the shooting community was fundamentally supportive and honorable. The second sitting series marked a turning point in Maria's performance. Something clicked during the preparation period. A subtle adjustment in her grip pressure, a slight change in her breathing pattern, or perhaps just the accumulation of experience with the backup rifle. Whatever the cause, her shots began landing with mechanical precision, one after another in the center of the target. Spectators fell silent as they watched Maria work through the series. Each shot seemed to flow naturally from the last, with no apparent effort or strain. Her breathing was so controlled it was barely visible, and her trigger technique was flawless. When the series ended, she had posted another perfect 50, bringing her total score to 195 out of 200 possible points with only one phase remaining. The standing position phase was traditionally the most challenging, requiring shooters to maintain stability without any external support. Maria had always been competent in this position but had never considered it her strongest suit. Now, with a substantial lead in the overall competition, she faced the pressure of maintaining her advantage while using the least stable shooting position. As she prepared for the standing phase, Maria noticed that several competitors and coaches had gathered to watch her shoot. Word had spread throughout the facility about her remarkable performance with the backup rifle, and she was becoming the story of the championship. The attention could have been distracting, but Maria found it strangely motivating. She was representing more than just herself now. She was proving that skill and determination could overcome adversity. Her first standing series started shakily. The backup rifle felt heavy and awkward in the unsupported position, and her first 2 shots scored only 8s. Maria could feel doubt beginning to creep into her mind, but she forced herself to follow her pre-shot routine exactly as she had practiced. The third shot was a 10, followed by another 10, and then a 9. The series total of 45 was disappointing but not catastrophic. During the break, Coach Thompson approached with quiet encouragement. He reminded her that standing was always the most variable discipline, and that her lead was still substantial. More importantly, he could see that she was overthinking her shots instead of trusting her natural ability. His advice was simple: stop trying to be perfect and just let her training take over. The wisdom of his words became apparent in the final series. Maria stepped up to the firing line with a clear mind, focusing not on the score she needed, but on executing each shot to the best of her ability. She settled into her standing position with greater confidence, feeling the backup rifle's weight distribute naturally across her body. Her breathing slowed, her heart rate steadied, and the target seemed to come into sharper focus. The first shot of the final series was a perfect 10 dead center in the X-ring. The crowd that had gathered to watch remained absolutely silent, understanding that they were witnessing something special. Maria's second shot was another 10, followed by a third and fourth. With one shot remaining, she had already secured the victory, but she was beyond caring about scores or standings. She was shooting for the pure satisfaction of perfect execution. The final shot of the championship seemed to hang in the air longer than physics would allow. Maria knew from the moment the trigger broke that it was perfect. She could feel it in the rifle's recoil, in the sight picture at the moment of firing, in the absolute stillness of her position. When the target was scored, it showed a 10 that appeared to be dead center in the X-ring. The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, applause began to build throughout the facility. Maria had not just won the championship. She had done so with a score that would have been impressive under any circumstances, let alone given the sabotage and equipment challenges she had faced. Her final series standing score was a perfect 50, bringing her overall total to 195 out of 200. As Maria set down the backup rifle for the final time, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in the victory, certainly, but also a deeper sense of accomplishment in having overcome such significant adversity. She had proven to herself that her skill as a marksman wasn't dependent on any particular piece of equipment, but came from years of disciplined practice and mental development. Coach Thompson was the first to reach her, his usual composure completely abandoned as he wrapped her in a congratulatory embrace. The rest of her team followed, their excitement infectious and genuine. They had all been affected by the sabotage, but Maria's performance had vindicated their entire program and approach to the sport. The awards ceremony took place an hour later, with Maria standing on the top step of the podium as the regional champion. As the national anthem played and she felt the weight of the gold medal around her neck, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The sabotage that had seemed so devastating a week ago had actually become the catalyst for her greatest competitive achievement. During the media interviews that followed, Maria was asked repeatedly about the sabotage and how it had affected her performance. Her answers were gracious but brief. She preferred to talk about the support she had received from her team, her coach, and the broader shooting community. The controversy would eventually fade, but the relationships and lessons learned would last a lifetime. As the team prepared to leave the facility, Maria took one last look at the competition range where she had achieved something truly special. She had proven that true champions were defined not by their response to favorable circumstances, but by their ability to excel when everything seemed to be working against them. The backup rifle that had seemed like such a disadvantage had actually become the instrument of her greatest triumph. The drive home from the championship was unlike any Maria had experienced after a competition. Usually, the team would analyze every shot, discussing what had worked and what needed improvement for the next event. This time, the van was filled with a celebratory atmosphere that mixed excitement about the victory with amazement at how dramatically the week had unfolded. Maria sat quietly in the back seat, the gold medal still around her neck, trying to process everything that had happened. News of her victory had already spread beyond the shooting community. Local television stations were preparing features about the teenage marksman who had overcome sabotage to win the regional championship. The story had all the elements that made for compelling sports: drama, adversity, determination, and ultimate triumph. Maria's phone buzzed constantly with congratulatory messages from friends, family, and people she had never met. The revelation about Jennifer Walsh's involvement in the sabotage had sent shockwaves throughout the competitive shooting world. As more details emerged from the police investigation, a picture developed of a talented shooter who had become consumed by the pressure to win. Jennifer's family had invested enormous amounts of money in her shooting career, and college scouts had been watching her performance closely. The fear of failure had apparently driven her to desperate measures. Maria found herself feeling unexpectedly sympathetic toward Jennifer, despite what she had done. The pressure that young athletes face to succeed could be overwhelming, and she understood how easy it would be to make poor decisions when everything seemed to be at stake. The shooting community had always prided itself on fair play and sportsmanship, and Jennifer's actions had damaged that reputation in ways that would take time to heal. The police investigation had uncovered a sophisticated plan that went beyond simple equipment sabotage. Jennifer had recruited her older brother, a former military technician, to carry out the actual break-in and equipment damage. They had studied the school's security systems for weeks and had detailed knowledge of the team's equipment and routines. The level of planning involved made the crime seem even more serious and calculated. Detective Morrison completed her investigation 3 days after the championship, recommending felony charges against both Jennifer and her brother. The case would likely result in significant legal consequences, including the possibility of prison time. Jennifer's shooting career was effectively over, and her college scholarship opportunities had evaporated overnight. The price of her poor decision-making would be paid for years to come. Maria's performance at the championship had earned her an automatic qualification for the national tournament, scheduled to take place in 6 weeks at an Olympic training facility in Colorado Springs. The opportunity was everything she had dreamed of, but it also brought new pressures and expectations. Media attention continued to grow, and she found herself being portrayed as both a victim who had overcome adversity and a rising star in the world of precision shooting. The backup rifle that had served her so well during the championship was returned to the range where she had borrowed it. Frank Mueller, the gunsmith who had worked tirelessly to repair her original rifle, presented her with the restored weapon in a brief ceremony at his workshop. The rifle looked perfect, and initial testing showed that its accuracy had been largely restored, but Maria found herself oddly reluctant to abandon the backup rifle that had carried her to victory. Coach Thompson recognized Maria's attachment to the backup rifle and arranged for the team to purchase it from the range. The transaction was complicated by the fact that the rifle had become something of a celebrity in its own right, featured in newspaper photos and television reports about Maria's championship victory. The range owner was reluctant to sell, but eventually agreed, understanding the sentimental value the weapon held for Maria. Training for the national championship required a completely different level of preparation. Maria would be competing against the best young shooters in the country, many of whom had been training for this opportunity their entire lives. The competition would be longer and more demanding than anything she had previously experienced, testing not just shooting skill but mental endurance and physical stamina. Maria's daily routine intensified significantly. She was now training 6 days a week, spending 4 hours each morning at the range and 2 hours each afternoon on physical conditioning and mental preparation. Her academic schedule was adjusted to accommodate the training demands, with several teachers providing independent study options to help her maintain her grades while pursuing her shooting goals. The media attention surrounding Maria's story had attracted the interest of several equipment sponsors. Representatives from rifle manufacturers, scope companies, and ammunition producers approached her with endorsement deals and offers of free equipment. The attention was flattering but also overwhelming for a 17-year-old who had always been focused purely on the sport itself rather than its commercial aspects. Her father helped her navigate the sponsorship opportunities, consulting with lawyers and other experienced shooters about the implications of various deals. They eventually signed a modest agreement with a rifle manufacturer that would provide equipment and financial support for her training expenses without requiring extensive promotional commitments. The goal was to maintain Maria's focus on shooting rather than marketing activities. The backup rifle underwent extensive customization to better fit Maria's specific requirements. Frank Mueller worked with her to adjust the stock dimensions, modify the trigger mechanism, and mount a scope that perfectly matched her preferences. The work took several weeks, during which Maria practiced with yet another borrowed rifle, continuing to demonstrate her ability to adapt to different equipment. Maria's teammates were dealing with their own challenges as they prepared for state-level competitions. The sabotage incident had affected the entire team's equipment, and while the damage to their rifles was less severe than what Maria had experienced, it still required significant repair work. The team's success at regionals had earned them recognition and support from the school administration, but it had also increased the pressure on them to continue performing at a high level. The shooting community's response to the sabotage incident was swift and decisive. New security protocols were implemented at competitions, and equipment storage requirements were strengthened. A fund was established to help teams that experienced similar incidents, and educational programs were developed to address the psychological pressures that young athletes faced. Jennifer Walsh's actions had created problems, but they had also sparked important conversations about sportsmanship and mental health in competitive shooting. Maria began working with a sports psychologist to help her manage the increased attention and pressure that came with her newfound success. The sessions focused on maintaining perspective and staying grounded in her fundamental love for the sport. The psychologist helped her understand that external recognition and expectations were secondary to her personal satisfaction and continued improvement as a marksman. 3 weeks before the national championship, Maria participated in a training camp for elite young shooters. The experience was both humbling and inspiring as she worked alongside athletes who had been competing at the highest levels for years. She quickly realized that her championship victory, while impressive given the circumstances, represented just the beginning of her development as a serious competitor. The training camp was conducted by former Olympic shooters and national team coaches who brought a level of expertise that Maria had never experienced. They analyzed every aspect of her technique using high-speed cameras and computer analysis, identifying small inefficiencies that could be corrected to improve her performance. The feedback was detailed and sometimes overwhelming, but Maria absorbed it eagerly. One of the most valuable aspects of the training camp was learning from other young shooters who had faced similar challenges and pressures. Many had stories of equipment failures, family conflicts, or academic struggles that had threatened their shooting careers. Their experiences helped Maria understand that adversity was a normal part of athletic development rather than something unique to her situation. The customized backup rifle was completed 2 weeks before the national championship, and Maria's first practice session with the modified weapon exceeded all expectations. The rifle felt like an extension of her body, responding to her slightest movements with precision and consistency. Her scores in practice were higher than she had ever achieved, even with her original rifle before the sabotage. Frank Mueller had incorporated lessons learned from repairing Maria's original rifle into the modifications of the backup weapon. The trigger was adjusted to exactly her preferred specifications, the stock was fitted to her unique body dimensions, and the scope was mounted with mathematical precision. The result was a rifle that was optimally configured for Maria's specific shooting style and physical characteristics. News coverage of Maria's preparation for nationals continued to grow, with several major sports networks expressing interest in covering the competition. The shooting sports community was excited about the increased attention, as it brought visibility to a sport that was often overlooked by mainstream media. Maria found herself becoming an unofficial spokesperson for competitive shooting, a role she accepted with both pride and trepidation. The week before nationals, Maria made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She chose to spend the time training at her original home range rather than at the sophisticated facilities that had been made available to her. The familiar surroundings and simple equipment helped her reconnect with the fundamental joy she felt when shooting, reminding her of why she had fallen in love with the sport in the first place. Her father, who had been her first coach and remained her most trusted advisor, spent long hours with her during this final preparation period. They didn't focus on technical improvements or competitive strategies, but instead talked about the journey they had shared and the values that had guided them throughout her development as a shooter. The conversations reinforced Maria's understanding that success was about more than scores and rankings. Coach Thompson organized a send-off ceremony for Maria at the school, with the entire shooting team and many other students attending. The event was both a celebration of her achievement and a reminder of the community that had supported her throughout the challenges of the past months. Speeches were given highlighting her perseverance and sportsmanship, qualities that had made her victory even more meaningful. The night before departing for nationals, Maria spent time alone in her room, surrounded by the medals and certificates that documented her journey as a shooter. She thought about Jennifer Walsh and wondered how different things might have been if the pressure and expectations hadn't overwhelmed her rival's judgment. The experience had taught Maria important lessons about perspective and priorities that would serve her well regardless of how the national competition turned out. As she packed her equipment for the trip to nationals, Maria carefully placed both her original rifle and the customized backup weapon in their cases. She had decided to bring both, not because she was uncertain about which to use, but because each represented an important chapter in her development as a shooter. The original rifle symbolized years of patient development and the importance of the athlete-equipment relationship. The backup rifle represented adaptability, resilience, and the ability to excel even when circumstances weren't ideal. The final entry in Maria's training log before leaving for nationals was brief but significant. She wrote about her gratitude for the experiences of the past months, both positive and negative, and her excitement about the competition ahead. Most importantly, she noted that regardless of the outcome at nationals, she had already achieved her most important victory by proving to herself that she could overcome any obstacle through preparation, determination, and faith in her abilities. The championship that had started with sabotage and seemed to threaten the end of her shooting career had instead become the foundation for greater opportunities and deeper self-knowledge. As Maria fell asleep the night before leaving for nationals, she understood that the real victory hadn't been the score she posted or the medal she won, but the person she had become in the process of overcoming seemingly impossible challenges. The backup rifle had been ruined on purpose, but from that deliberate destruction had emerged something stronger and more precious than anyone could have imagined.